I don't see Deb. Is Deb here? Alyssa, can you hear me?
Mayor, I can hear you.
Oh, okay. Alyssa, do we have everybody? Is Deb back yet?
I'm unsure if Councilmember McMillan is online. She seems to be, but unsure.
All right, we'll give her just a minute here. Are we live yet?
Just became live, yes.
Okay. For the public, we'll start in just a minute. We're waiting for everybody to get here after the workshop. All right, folks, let's go ahead and get going. I'm not sure if Deb's with us yet. If not, she'll join in just a moment. So I call to order the regular meeting of the Victoria City Council for Monday, November 9th, 2020 at 6:36 p.m. First order of business is the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Judy, I think you and Deb were muted, by the way. So that's right. Let's keep going. I have a few announcements. First off, there was going to be a special meeting of the City Council to canvass the election results on Thursday. Due to some of the mechanics of how that happens, that meeting has been moved. So there will now be a special meeting of the City Council on Friday, 10 a.m., November 13th, down at City Hall. The meeting will be limited for one purpose and one purpose only, and that is to canvass the general election results. So if you were planning on attending, note the date change. Again, it's Friday now, 10 a.m., 13 November. Other announcements, the City Council will hold a workshop on November 23rd at 5:30 p.m. to discuss the city's land trust lot fund, affordable housing fund. And then finally, there will be a City Council workshop on December 14th at 5:30 p.m. to discuss the 2019-2020 strategic plan results. As always, all meetings of the City Council are open to the public and are held in the council chambers unless otherwise noted. Alyssa, do we have any open forum items from the public?
Mayor, council members, we do not have anyone for the open forum.
All right, thank you. With that, council, can I get somebody to please make a motion to adopt the final agenda, please?
I make a motion we adopt the final agenda.
Thank you, Councilmember Gregory. Second, please.
Second, Judy.
Thank you. Roll call vote. Deb?
Aye.
Judy?
Aye.
Tom Gregory?
Aye.
Tom Vogt?
Aye.
Thank you. I vote aye. Agenda is adopted. Consent agenda. Council, can I get a motion to approve the consent agenda, please?
I make a motion that we adopt the consent agenda. This is Deb.
Thank you, Deb. Second, please.
Second, this is Judy.
Thank you. Does anybody need staff, council? Does anybody want to pull anything off the consent agenda? Going once, twice. Hearing none. Roll call vote to approve the consent agenda. Deb?
Aye.
Thank you. Judy?
Aye.
Thank you. Tom Gregory?
Aye.
Thank you. Tom Vogt?
Aye.
Mayor votes aye. The consent agenda is adopted. With that, we are now to the first item on the regular agenda. And this is item 6.1. Consider adoption of updated Shoreland District Regulations Ordinance and approval of resolution for summary publication. Marty, I assume this is you?
This is me, Mayor. Thank you, Mayor Council. I'm just working on
before you begin, just real quick, let the council know what you're looking for us to do tonight, and then if you will, go ahead and join or start your presentation.
Yes, absolutely. So Mayor, members of the council, we are asking the council to consider adoption of a revised Shoreland District Regulations Ordinance. It is an ordinance that staff, the Planning Commission, and the Lakes and Water Quality Committee, along with the DNR, have been working on for really several years, but very intensely the last 9 to 10 months. To try to find a ordinance that meets the requirements of the Department of Natural Resources, as well as allows some flexibility required by our community for the things that we're doing. So we will be, after our discussion today, we'll be asking the council to consider adopting that revised ordinance, as well as approving a resolution for summary publication of that ordinance.
All right, thank you, Marty. Please proceed.
So, as I mentioned, we have been working on this ordinance update for quite some time, but before I get into the highlights of some of the things that will be different from what we currently have within our Shoreland ordinance, I wanted to provide just a little bit of a background as to why we have gone through this exercise. So, the city of Victoria, like every other city, county that has lakes, water bodies, rivers, has a Shoreland District Regulations Ordinance. It regulates parcels and developments within 1,000 feet of designated lakes, ponds, and flowage, and 300 feet from rivers and streams. The last significant review or update of the city of Victoria's ordinance was in 2002. And since at least that time, it has been out of compliance with the Minnesota DNR model ordinance. Why that is important is because when a shoreland ordinance is not in compliance with the DNR then has review and approval authority over a number of land use applications, developments, and things that are happening that typically would be only the local jurisdiction's authority to approve, but because the shoreland ordinance is not in compliance, they have some additional approval authority. So in 2017, the DNR did their own update of the Shoreland Management Model Ordinance, which had a number of requirements and best practices, and I believe that is around the time that the city initially began looking at revising its Shoreland Ordinance to come into compliance with that model ordinance. And as I mentioned, cities and counties that adopt an ordinance that is approved by the DNR will regain full control over land use decisions within a shoreland, and the DNR really becomes an advisory function. We are still required to send them applications similar to how we would work with the watershed district, who can provide feedback, can provide recommendations, but the ultimate decision lands on the local authority. So just a little bit of a timeline as to how we got to where we are today. So as I mentioned, around 2017, slightly before, there were some ordinance updates that had started and stopped multiple times. No substantial changes were made. In 2017, the city contracted with HKGI, a planning consultant, to help with an ordinance update. They worked with the city for about a year, and in 2018, the city submitted a spreadsheet of potential ordinance updates to the DNR. The DNR at that time provided feedback on several areas that they had of concern, and more negotiations were proposed. Around that time, then in 2019, as you know, there was a lot of staff turnover in the community development and planning area. So the ordinance update project was put on hold. So since early 2020, staff has re-engaged in that update process, and that included an extensive review of our current ordinance, the DNR model ordinance, the changes that were proposed in 2018, and then as well as several meetings from the Planning Commission, Lakes and Water Quality Advisory Committee. And you can see here, just in 2020 alone, we've brought this item forward to the Planning Commission 7 times, including a public hearing in July. We held 2 additional joint meetings with the Planning Commission and the LQAC. The LQAC held 3 individual meetings, and then we did have this as a workshop discussion earlier this summer for the council. So we've had several rounds of discussion, including the revisions and discussions with DNR staff. So through all of those rounds of discussion and feedback and revisions on October 27th, we had a ordinance that we had been preliminarily told by the DNR that was looking like they were going to approve. So on October 27th, our Planning Commission unanimously recommended the approval of that ordinance. And then on November 3rd, we did receive that letter of conditional approval from the DNR, which was included in your background packet. So tonight, again, as I mentioned earlier, we're asking the council to consider adoption of the updated Shoreland District Regulations Ordinance. And if the council does adopt that ordinance, the staff will complete the steps that are needed for final approval by the DNR. To get to that point, we will discuss some of the highlights of that updated ordinance this evening. In addition, we do also have representing the Planning Commission, Vice Chair Laura Moore, and representing the Lakes and Water Quality Advisory Committee, Chair Ann Holscher, who are on the line and will be able to answer any questions you might have of them and the process that took place in their meetings, if you so wish. So with that, let's walk through some of the areas that we've pulled out that we've noted for review, discussion, some of the things that are changing a little bit from our existing ordinance. I did not want to go through the entire ordinance just because, as you saw in your background packet, it is very lengthy. But if in your review of that ordinance you have additional items or questions on any areas, please feel free to ask them and we can pull them up and discuss. But the areas that staff has highlighted for tonight's meeting include definitions that have changed, some flexibility requests granted by the DNR for nonconformities, some updates to the shoreland classification system, so some additional water bodies and tributaries that have been added, land uses, what is allowed, conditional, not permitted, lot area and width standards, which is one of the important factors of this ordinance, some special residential provisions, vegetation management, stormwater management, and residential planned unit developments. So as I go through, I will pause between each area for questions, but again, being virtual, feel free to interrupt me if I'm talking and you have any questions. So first, we do have a few definitions that have been revised based on some of the feedback from the DNR and some just additional housekeeping items on the city's side. One of them is the definition for impervious surface and lot coverage. The significant change in this definition, it is something that was recommended by the DNR and that the Planning Commission chose to recommend moving forward, is to remove swimming pools as an exception to the impervious surface calculation in a lot. So previously, the surface of a swimming pool would not be calculated as impervious surface. Based on feedback from the DNR, the surface of a pool, especially when it is covered, does create runoff. So they were having a little bit of difficulty justifying how that surface is not impervious in a shoreline district. So we have struck swimming pools as an exception to that. And then we also did want to include a clause that any swimming pools that have been permitted prior to the adoption of this ordinance would not count toward a lot's impervious surface maximum. The reason for that being that if a lot had put in a swimming pool and was under the impression that they still had 500 square feet of impervious surface to work with in their property for an addition or a shed or something, that would not get taken away with the change of this. So this would only be for swimming pools installed going forward that they would count towards that impervious surface calculation. The second definition, this is a new definition for a patio or a detached deck. The city of Victoria defines deck very specifically, that a deck is attached to a home, and the Shoreland Ordinance has some regulations and requirements for detached decks, which are sometimes common in lakefront areas. So to help connect those dots, we've created a definition for a patio or a detached deck, which essentially is a roofless outdoor space constructed from pavement, pavers, stone, decking, etc., that does not project from the wall of the building. And in order to meet the DNR's requirements for those, a patio or a detached deck is considered an accessory structure. One of the items in our impervious surface definition is that we allow an exception for permeable patios or walkways. However, permeable patios or walkways were never defined in the code. So this is a new definition that defines what those permeable patio or walkways are. The definition essentially is saying that they need to be consistent with the specifications found in the Minnesota Stormwater Manual. So they have a very specific set of guidelines as to what they consider permeable or pervious when it comes to pavers and those types of things. So this would require it to meet those standards to be considered permeable patio or walkway for using as an exception to impervious surface. The additional piece to this is that the DNR worried about the potential of someone using an entire lot area as a permeable pavement surface. So they wanted to limit the size of how much someone could use to that would not count towards impervious surface. So where we landed with the DNR and with the Planning Commission is that anything that would exceed 2% of the total lot area would count as impervious. So you essentially would be able to get 27% impervious surface versus 25% impervious surface in a shoreland district if you are using permeable materials for some of your traditionally impervious surfaces. The next definition is steep slopes. So as the council may recall, there had been some discussion and some changes made to the city's definition and ordinance related to steep slopes recently. We initially had used the updated revised definition for steep slopes to send to the DNR, and the DNR had some concerns with the steep slope being measured at 18% versus 12%. So we went back and did a little bit of research on that previous ordinance change. As I understand from some of the previous council minutes and reviewing them, that there was a little bit of hesitancy for that change initially. There were some reservations about approving the ordinance when the tree preservation ordinance and shoreland ordinance addressed similar concerns, and wanted to make sure that it allowed some flexibility, and that in fact this was supposed to be noted as a temporary change until a more holistic view could be taken to address all of the concerns. So we did do that with the DNR. We talked about what this means to be steep slopes. And ultimately, at the end of the day, based on DNR recommendation and discussions with the Planning Commission, we are recommending that steep slopes definition be reverted back to what it had been traditionally, which is slopes over 12% versus those that are 18%. The DNR and shoreland districts defines an 18% slope as a bluff, and there are some differences in how bluffs are regulated versus steep slopes. So it seemed to be the cleanest, and knowing that there was some hesitancy with that original change, to revert back to the original definition of steep slopes. Are there any questions with any of those or other definitions?
No. I have a question, Marty.
Yeah.
The steep slope, if we're going to revert back to 12%, did we do the housekeeping on those other ordinances to revert those back as well? Councilmember
McMillan, members of the council, yes, that is our next item tonight. Once we get through the shoreland ordinance, we have a number of, I shouldn't say a number, but a handful of housekeeping items within our zoning code and other sections that will need to be revised, that we'll be talking about after the shoreland ordinance.
Very good, thank you.
All right, so moving on, this next section on nonconformities is actually a flexibility request that the DNR has granted the city. It is a provision that is included in the city's existing ordinance, and it was something with discussions in the Planning Commission that they wished to try to maintain, and we were able to do that with some additional language related to it. But What this says is that an addition or an expansion to the outside dimensions of an existing non-conforming structure, so if you've got a structure that is already encroaching upon the ordinary high water line setback, and someone wants to make an addition to that home, they are able to do that without a variance, with the following conditions: that it does not get any closer to the water, so they'd be allowed to add on towards the back or the side; that it does not increase in height beyond either 25 feet or the height of the existing building, whichever is greater; that it adheres to the applicable front, rear, and side yard setbacks of the underlying zoning district; that it does not exceed allowable impervious surface standards. So all four of those were conditions that were in more or less in our existing ordinance. And the DNR, in an effort to allow this to happen, also requested that as part of this, there would be a requirement to install and maintain a natural vegetation buffer along the shoreline if one does not already exist. That would be a minimum of 80% of that shoreline and up to 10 feet inward from the high water line. So by meeting those conditions, someone would be able to do an addition to their non-conforming home without a variance. The second piece of non-conformities is related to those similar structures that are encroaching upon the ordinary high water line, but that an individual would like to tear down, complete or down to the existing foundation, and rebuild in the same location. So with this section from our existing code, people have the ability to request a variance to be able to do that, to maintain that existing nonconformity. So it would not be just administratively allowed. It would have to go through a variance process. And then there are some conditions related to that variance if the council were to consider it, that it would not alter the essential character of the neighborhood. Again, that it will not encroach farther to the high water line setback. And in addition with this one, if it's a house that's being torn down, that it cannot be less than 50 feet from that high water line. That there's also then a calculation, I didn't put the full calculation in the slide, but it's in the ordinance, that side yard setbacks are reduced proportionately based on the encroachment. So depending on how many feet you are encroaching towards the water, you have to increase your side yard setbacks with that home. And there's a calculation in the ordinance that does that there would be a maximum height with those rebuilds of 25 feet. And then again, that this would require the installation and maintenance of a natural riparian buffer if one does not exist.
I have a question on the variance will not alter the essential character of the neighborhood. So can you explain that? Because what if they want to tear like a cottage down and put up a really nice house?
I can, and we actually have some additional language in the ordinance. I abbreviated it for this slide, but I will tell you what the specific ordinance language says. So in that section, it says the variance will not alter the essential character of the neighborhood. Considerations will include the height, mass, and setback of structures on adjacent lots, presence of vegetation, and visibility from the lake. So it states that those are the items that the council is supposed to be taking into consideration when trying to determine if it's altering the essential character of the neighborhood.
Okay, it's not the style of the house.
No.
Okay.
It is subjective though, isn't it?
Yeah, sounds like it has to look like the neighborhood.
Any additional questions on nonconformities?
No.
All right, moving on. So as I mentioned earlier, the DNR did add some additional lakes, water body, wetland type areas to the classification system that would fall under the rules of the Shoreland District Ordinance. Those are a few new unnamed lakes, and then as well as we have added to our list our growth area lakes, so that in the event those lakes are annexed, an ordinance amendment is not needed. the new unnamed lakes, and that they're not really lakes. If you look at a aerial map, they're more of a wetland marshy area that have been added, are this unnamed stretch here, kind of between Auburn, Carl Cray, and Wasserman. This small unnamed wetland area down here. And then there are a few that are up in the park area that have been added, as well as this unnamed lake that would be in our growth area. One of the questions and one of the things we discussed in the Planning Commission is, why would this kind of wetland, not really a lake be considered a recreational development lake, which is what our pink lakes are. This again is a result of our discussions with the DNR, because the areas around these areas are primarily already developed and have homes that are mostly consistent with what a recreational development lake regulations would be. The DNR said they don't want to create a number of nonconformities. They want them to be governed with some of the other shoreland regulations, but by classifying them as a recreational development lake, your lot areas and widths and things that are pretty consistent with what those of a recreational development lake are would not create those nonconformities. So this map does show all of the water bodies that would fall anywhere within 1,000 feet of these colored water bodies would be considered a shoreland district. Any questions on the classification system?
No.
All right, the next item I wanted to highlight is just the land use table. So the table on the next slide that I will pull up is going to show what is considered permitted, conditional, and not permitted land uses within shoreland districts based on the lake classification. So you can see our lake classifications in the columns to the right, as well as our tributaries, and then whether those uses are permitted, conditional, or not allowed. So you'll see that single family residential is permitted in all of these districts. Duplex is permitted in all but general development lakes. They're listed as conditional. This is something that is a carryover from our existing ordinance, that duplexes and above were conditional uses. And then also in our existing ordinance, we also have had anything above triplex as a conditional use for these areas. So essentially anything that would be making more than a duplex would have to go through a PUD process for review in these shoreline district areas. You'll see obviously a PUD is a conditional use. Accessory dwelling units are conditional uses. The water dependent commercial, if it's accessory to a residential PUD, which we don't, I believe, have any of those in residential districts currently, but if they were to be requested, would be conditional. Commercial, conditional. Controlled access lots, conditional. Holding tanks, so septic tanks, if it's an unsewered property, that would be a conditional use. Solar power facilities, conditional, which is consistent with our other zoning districts. Parks and historic sites, conditional. Public government or institutional buildings, facilities as permitted. Industrial, conditional in all areas other than in natural environment, shoreland areas. Agricultural, permitted, and then the remaining items not permitted. New feedlots or expansions of feedlots, forest land conversion, so cutting down trees for timber, that sort of thing. Extractive uses or mining would be not permitted uses. Any questions on the land use table?
No.
Marty?
Yes.
Tom Gregory here. Solar power facilities, what was the thought process in including that? Is that a common thing for the DNR?
Yeah, so we have those as conditional uses in our underlying residential districts currently. So the idea was that we wanted to make sure it was also listed within a shoreland district as a conditional use, so it would be consistent with how the city has governed those in the past. I have not had any experience or any requests with any of those items in my time here, but was working off of the existing zoning districts when that was pulled over.
My personal belief is if we're trying to protect the natural beauty of our wetlands, that certainly is counterproductive to solar power facility.
And it is one of the nice things about making these conditional uses is that they then have a planning commission and a city council process to go through, so they can be handled on a case-by-case basis. And I think similar to some of those variance requests, you would want to consider the impact on the area and the neighborhood when considering those items.
Okay.
So Marty, are you saying that this is a solar power facility like a utility company?
So a solar powered facility as a principal land use would be like a solar farm, right? Someone has 10 acres of land and they want to set up solar panels somewhere in an area to provide electricity.
On a lake?
Well, within a shoreland district, which is you need to remember is within 1,000 feet of the lake. So there's a lot of land that's considered a shoreland district that's not necessarily on a lake shore.
Okay.
Any other questions? All right, lot area and width standards. I think this is the area that we have spent the most amount of time on discussing with our various advisory boards. A number of revisions have taken place to this over the time we started this. As you have noted from some of the public feedback you have received, there is some questions or concerns. So I just want to walk through what is currently in the ordinance, talk about a little bit about the path or the process to get to that point, show some examples, and then I'll open that one up for the council to discuss as well. So with the lot area and width standards, I think as you'll recall from our previous workshop earlier this summer, Victoria has quite a bit more restrictive standards than what the DNR standards are for lot area and width on a lot of lake classifications. And we also had shown you at that time some of the comparable tables showing what other areas, neighboring cities, market cities had when it came to those lot area and width requirements. And Victoria was at the top of most of those. However, that being said, that's not necessarily a bad thing, right? Victoria is the city of lakes and parks. It's been developed as the city of lakes and parks with some larger lot areas. They've become the character of a lot of neighborhoods by having these larger lots. So in discussion with both the Lakes and Water Quality Committee as well as the Planning Commission, there was a very strong thought and recommendation that within the existing city limits, within current Victoria established neighborhoods, those requirements should not be reduced. They should maintain what they are currently in the shoreland management ordinance that we have in place. So you can see on this table that the current proposal states that any shoreline districts within the city limits at the time this ordinance is adopted would have the same lot area and width standards as currently exist. That would be for lakeshore for natural environment lakes, an acre compared to 40,000 in the DNRs, an acre on recreational development compared to 20,000, just shy of an acre for general development lakes, which Lake Minnetonka is our one general development lake that we have lakeshore properties, as opposed to 15,000. And then in the non-riparian, so the non-shoreline lots, 20 and 20 for natural environment, 20 versus 15 from the DNR for recreational development, and 21.7 versus 10 for general development lakes. The thought process behind keeping the current lake standards for our current developed lakes is that if you were to go down to the DNR standards, you potentially have the ability that in recreational development lakes, specifically general development lakes as well, that a single lot can turn into 2 lots in the general development lake area, potentially 3 lots. And that you really pose a risk of increasing a lot of density in your established lakeshore neighborhoods. So there was consensus from both the Lakes and Water Quality Committee and the Planning Commission that they wanted to make sure that those standards stay the same for existing lakes. And here you'll see the lot width comparison as well. So staying at 100 versus 75 or 50 for recreational development lakes and general development lakes. So then the conversation was, what do you do then with those areas that will potentially become part of the city at some point in time that don't necessarily have the established lakeshore neighborhoods and the larger lots that are currently in place? So what the Planning Commission has recommended and what is before you today is essentially grandfathering our existing lakes into our current standards, and any newly annexed lakes would have the DNR standards or the less restrictive standards. And I've got a couple of maps that I will point out some of those areas to you in a minute. So there was not necessarily a majority or a consensus among the Lakes and Water Quality Committee on how to handle those non-city lakes, but the Planning Commission, and we did talk about this several times, specifically felt that in order to strike a balance, potentially have some smaller lakeshore lots that are going to be more affordable to provide opportunities for folks to live on a lakeshore that maybe wouldn't on an acre plus lot, that it made sense to have these less restrictive standards in our annexed lakes. So you will see the differences here. The riparian natural environment lake, we're actually keeping the same at that acre. The recreational development lakes riparian at 20,000. General development lake is not applicable because there is not a general development lake in the growth area. And then with our riparian, it would be 15,000 versus 20 for natural environment and 15,000 versus 20 for recreational development lakes. So I'll show you a couple examples of that. This would also then be the lot width as well. The recreational development lakes would go from 100 to 75 in those annexed lakes. So when we're talking about those lakes that would be governed under these standards, we really have 2 recreational lakes that would be in our growth area, and then we have 3 or 4 smaller natural environment lakes that I'll show on my next slide. But the most significant change from what's in our current ordinance to what this ordinance is proposing would be on these recreational development lakes. And that would be Parley Lake and Piersons Lake. So I just did a little bit of crude drawing here to kind of show you the areas that we'd likely be talking about potentially for development around these areas. Three Rivers Park District owns almost the entire eastern side of Parley Lake. There's a large wetland complex that would not be buildable on the south side. Crown College owns a large area here on the west, as well as another wetland. So we're kind of looking at this area on the southwest side, as well as potentially some development on the north side that would fall under those updated standards. On Piersons Lake, as you know, there is already some single-family residential development in those areas, and I've got some close-ups that I'll show you here in just a minute, but there's kind of 4 little pockets of homes, this one as well up here that I didn't get circled, so 5 pockets of homes. The homes on the north and south side are already fairly consistent with what the DNR regulations would be, those 20,000 square foot riparian lots, the 80-foot wide lot width. In fact, a number of them are less than that already. The area on the east side here is a little bit more varied. It varies from about a half acre to a little over an acre, depending on those lots. And then there is a section of Piersons Lake that is larger lots. Most of these are in the 0.9 acre-ish range here. But when you kind of take a look at what's already happening on Piersons Lake, this is the north side that I had highlighted in yellow. You'll see there's a number of properties that are within that 20,000 square foot range, which would be what the regulations would be for those riparian lots. In fact, a number of them that are less than that. And then we've got widths ranging from 65 to 100 on most of these. And the new regulations would have a minimum of 80 for a lot width. And then comparable on that southwest side as well, you're seeing a lot of these homes in that 20,000 square foot range, a little bit wider lots, but as far as lot area goes, are pretty consistent with what that 20,000 square foot range would be. Whereas in our existing lakes, these would be acre 43,000 square foot minimum lots. So that's just a little bit of context as to what's happening on those recreational development lakes. I mentioned the natural environment lakes that have some potential for development. These are not as significant. The lakeshore maintains an acre, which is what it is in the current ordinance, and the non-riparian, so when you're not on the lakeshore, would go to 15,000 square feet versus 20,000 square feet. So not as significant of a change, but primarily looking at Turbid Lake, the west side of Carl Cray Lake, this unnamed water body on the in between the two, and Marsh Lake. Otherwise, the remainder of those natural environment lakes are all falling within the park district property to the north that are not going to develop. So, and one more point on lot area and width before I toss it back to you all. The other thing that is in our ordinance, which is, again is a carryover from our existing ordinance, is that unsewered homes are only allowed to be built on vacant lots if they're a lot of record at the time that this ordinance is adopted, of at least 1 acre for general and recreational development lakes, or 2 acres for natural environment lakes. And that lot width for these unsewered properties would need to be 270 feet. And multifamily homes are prohibited on unsewered shoreland properties. This is not as significant, again, within the current Victoria City limits, but as the city continues to grow, trying to discourage having large unsewered developments with a ton of septic tanks in those shoreland areas. So with that, I will turn it back over to the council to talk.
Thanks, Marty. Judy, do you want to go first? It seems like
this last topic on unsewered homes, I didn't think unsewered homes were allowed in the shoreland. Is this around the lake, or is this, I mean, where are we talking? I thought they had to have sewer.
No, in our current ordinance, you are allowed to have an unsewered property if it's a lot of record, and if it is at least an acre on those general development, recreational development, or 2 acres on natural environment. And then it also needs to be pretty wide. So when we're talking about most of the lakeshore widths in our sewered properties are between 80 and 125 feet in width. This needs to be 270 feet wide to be able to accommodate a septic. And as you'll recall, Councilmember Black, council members, any septic or holding tank is also a conditional use. So it would not necessarily be an allowed use. It'd be something that would have to be looked at for a lot of record looking to install a septic tank.
Okay, thank you.
Council, anyone else have questions for Marty? Hearing none, if there's no further questions, then Marty, can you put up the resolution?
Sorry, I just have a couple of other quick items to go through. I'll make those quick. I didn't know if there was going to be more conversation on that piece.
Nope, go ahead.
All right. I will get through these quickly. So special residential provisions, this is essentially governing controlled access lots. So similar to what was approved in the Waterford development for PUD, where they have that controlled access lot. This does allow them as a conditional use again, so would be up for review and revision by the Planning Commission and Council. Those lots need to be the minimum lot area and width of a riparian residential lot. And then to be consistent with our current ordinance and code on docks, there would allow only one dock and up to 3 unoccupied watercraft moored or stored there overnight. Vegetation management, this has been refined to revert to our tree removal and preservation ordinance. So indicating that any removal of trees is subject to that ordinance. And then also indicating that clear cutting, which clear cutting is defined as a complete removal of tree stands, is prohibited in any shore or bluff impact zones as well as steep slopes. So clearing is permitted, but coming in and cutting down every single tree in those areas is not. Stormwater management, so maximum impervious surface coverage. The central business district, which is within a shoreland here, is the DNR approved flexibility to allow up to 80% impervious in that commercial business district for zoning. All other zoning districts would be 25%, which is what is in our existing ordinance.
Marty, let me interrupt. Go
Yeah.
back one more slide about the clear cutting.
Yeah.
We've had problems with this before, and the city had few, if any, options as far as what we're going to be able to do, assuming somebody comes in and does this. So is there anywhere in here where we've strengthened that? So if somebody does this, we can force them to restore it 100%, fines, any other options? Was this discussed?
So clear cutting would be prohibited, and Bob, I might toss that over to you. Our ordinance would have some ramifications related to breaking the ordinance. We do have a requirement in here when it comes to this vegetation management that, again, if there's any trimming, even if it's not clear cutting, which may be allowed through the tree preservation ordinance, that there is a requirement for ground cover. It is also, there's a new provision in this ordinance that requires any of those replacement trees that are required from that replacement ordinance to be, if technically possible, to be replanted in the areas where they've been cleared. So if a slope needs to be partially cleared, that any of those replacement trees need to go back in another area of that slope. But Bob, as far as the enforcement piece of that ordinance?
Yeah, Mayor and Council, I think the answer with respect to enforcement, putting aside what Marty was just talking about, the situation where it's we've got a mechanism for allowing some clear cutting with replacement planned out ahead. Putting that aside, enforcement would be as with essentially all other ordinances. If we knew something was going to happen in advance, if we knew that there was a plan for clear cutting in a way that we didn't think was compliant with the city code, the city could certainly seek a court order, bring a suit and get a court order preventing that from occurring. If, as is more typical, we discover something that involves clear cutting after it's occurred or as it's occurring, that's a violation of the code. It's a misdemeanor and it would be prosecuted, presumably. So, and those tools are often viewed as either ineffective because we don't know it's going to happen in advance, or if we know after the fact it's hitting a mosquito with a sledgehammer. But those are the standard tools for enforcement for all of our requirements, and this is no exception.
Okay, thanks, Bob. But we already have the example here in Victoria where, fool me once, shame on you, fool me twice, shame on me, where a homeowner clear-cut trees, and the solution that was decided was a different type of tree that didn't really belong, planted along the edge of the property, and it ended up with nothing in the shoreland at all. And one of the other arguments I've heard is even if you say, okay, we're going to fine you $100 per tree, people will say, fine, I'm going to take down 10 trees, find me $1,000. I still get the trees out of the way and I get the view I want, which really goes against the spirit and the intent of the ordinance. So the question is specific to this, right? Clear cutting with a developer and replacement trees is all part of that development process. Do we, or can we, and should we, and this is as much a question for you as it is for the council, should we in fact put something in there that is significant enough to deter somebody from after the fact going in and cutting it all down because there's no repercussions? They basically can just do what they want, and the city is left with no options, which is what has happened to us once. I want to try to prevent that because that's not what anybody intended. So, Bob, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, again, where we can know in advance about a disagreement about whether land is a steep slope or is otherwise not able to be cleared away. We can know in advance about that. We can resolve that happily or not in the courts. But, Mayor, to your point, when we don't know about it in advance and it's occurred or it's occurring, I think we staff could be asked to look into some other mechanisms, but the traditional mechanism is to someone for violating the code and prosecute. And Mayor, you're right. The criminal penalties, the penalties imposed in that are relatively small. I mean, I will tell you, of course, what you already know, which is that the societal view of that is negative, quite negative. And that's really, frankly, the largest penalty, punishment. You've been cited, prosecuted by your city, and presumably at the end of that found guilty. That's the biggest, frankly, deterrent. But, Mayor, we certainly can look into other sort of administrative approaches, city-imposed approaches that would be put more teeth into a person that would do that or a developer that would do that. But I don't, as I said, now have that answer. I'm sorry.
All right. Well, I think it's a question that needs to be discussed. This has come up a couple of times before in the past years. And so I don't want to hold this up because I think this is the right thing to do for the city. But council, I'd like to get just a quick yes or no. Is this something that we should ask Dana and the staff to look at, that specific issue about enforcement and whether or not the council should consider some sort of enforcement options other than just simply a misdemeanor, which is, as Bob stated, is basically ineffective?
Mayor, this is Deb. I favor an education approach. I don't think this is a widespread problem. And I think folks that do live on the shorelines of the water really understand the importance of keeping those waters clean and healthy. And I guess my opinion is I would favor a educational approach where we mail a letter to these folks and kind of state what our expectation of their stewardship of their land up on those, alongside those waters are.
Not a bad idea, but it clearly didn't work in the one case. So you're against having the staff look into other more stringent options?
I am. I favor an educational approach.
All right, Judy?
Well, I favor an educational approach as well, because a lot of people, they move here, they, living on the lake, they've never done it. They don't know all the things that they need to do, and being able to give them the access to that education so that they know when they blatantly go against it. I do feel that there should be repercussions, and I don't, to have to take them to court. I don't know. I've asked about it before, and it just seemed like we had our hands tied other than taking them to court, so I don't know what else we could do.
Well, that's why I'm asking to see if the council is interested in giving the city additional options other than taking them to court. Tom G., any thoughts?
Attorney Bose, is it as simple as just, do we get to set the amount of the fine? Can we just, throw a fine of $1,000 tree on it? Is that a simple approach, or?
Yeah, so Mayor and Council, that is the simple approach. That is an approach that cities have used historically in a variety of arenas, including maybe this one. That has been scrutinized quite a bit in the last decade or so, and the state auditor and the state attorney general have expressed views that cities have very limited authority to sort of create their own fining system outside of the courts, which is really what you're talking about, where we would set up our own process for imposing fines that would be more stringent or more effective than court-imposed fines. And so there's a legal issue about whether cities have that authority. We do have that authority, for example, when it comes to tobacco sales. Cities have been granted explicit authority by statute to have an administrative fining system in place for those kind of mistakes or those kind of violations. I'm not aware of us having that authority in this arena, but I don't want to foreclose another, let's call it alternative approach to enforcement that doesn't involve the relatively less effective approach of going to court, or at least it can be less effective. So I don't want to foreclose it, but I'm just telling you the reason I'm being circumspect about it is that that approach of administratively fining people has come under scrutiny and is disfavored, at least at the state level right now.
All right, thanks, Bob. Tom V, thoughts?
Couple thoughts. Clear cutting is a lake thing, and education will definitely help and perhaps prevent it. But the trees are part of a bigger problem that the city has, and with all development getting away from lakes, we do not do a good job of following up on what people do in terms of conforming to our ordinances regarding trees. So, for instance, a developer comes into an area and they're told that if they cut so many trees down, they have to replant. We do not ever go out and inspect to see if they did what they were supposed to do. And if they cut too many trees down or they cut trees down on slopes, we don't enforce because we really don't follow through. So I can see having a certain trepidation on clear cutting on lakes, but it's part of the bigger problem. Is we like to say that we're controlling the cutting down of trees, but we don't ever follow through, and no way of, other than if it's happening right in front of our face, we don't really enforce it. So I think the city still needs to come back to this, the tree thing. It's all on paper. What we're going to do with the trees is all on paper. It's never realistically followed through, particularly in new developments and slopes.
Yeah.
So there's a big concern here, and the clear cutting is a subset of that. Probably could be handled differently because it's a lake thing. I lived on a lake for a period of years, and we all knew the rules. And usually, people coming in this day and age, they know they can't just mow down all the trees to get their view improved. But I think it's part of a bigger thing, and the city really should come back to this because we don't really ever do anything. We just talk about it.
Right, exactly. And that's why I brought it up, because this is it's clearly tied to that. So there's mixed views here on the council. So let's do this. I'd ask the council to think about it and talk with Dana, and maybe we can get something scheduled either this year or the next council can pick that up, because it is a problem. We've got some demonstrated issues with both some of the stuff that Lennar did and some other what homeowners have done. So I think the city does have to come back to this and look at it and explore options to try to either better enforce it or come up with ways to prohibit behavior that is just really not acceptable. So let's table that for now so that we can finish going through what Marty has here, since we don't have a clear consensus on that point I raised.
Mayor?
Yep, go ahead.
Mayor, thank you. I thought I would just quickly jump in here, and Marty may have some additional things to share regarding some of the discussion we've just had. But as you know, we did eliminate our senior planner position, and as part of a restructure, we hired a code enforcement and planning technician. One of the reasons for refocusing and restructuring that position was to focus on issues such as the one that you're just describing, enforcing our ordinances. And the tree preservation and the tree inspections is one of the things that Isaac Peterson, who is our code enforcement technician and planning technician, he's been on board a couple of months now, and that's been one of the priorities that he's been focusing on. So Marty has also done some heavy lifting kind of concurrently with review of this shoreland management ordinance, the steep slopes and other tree preservation ordinance that we've been looking at, as they all kind of dovetail and go hand in hand in some ways or in a lot of ways. And so we've made some improvements. We're continuing to make improvements. Marty has actually detailed quite a plan to help us get a little bit further faster on this issue and similar issues related to enforcing of our ordinances, our zoning ordinances as well. So just wanted to note that, yes, that's been a challenge for us, mainly in the resource area, but we, through our restructuring, that is something that we expect to make progress on very quickly, and we feel like we have in the short time that Isaac and Marty have been on board.
All right, super. Just one final note. I'm not in favor of suing our citizens or going after them, but there's clearly, when there's blatant disregard for the rules, there's got to be consequences, and I think that's the point I was trying to have us look at. So we can come back to that at a later time, and yeah, I don't want to sidetrack us anything more. I think the points have been made. So Marty, council, unless there's any other comments, Marty, go ahead and continue.
Thank you, Mayor, council members. And just to piggyback off of what Dana said, we have done for all of our open developments, which there's been about probably 7 or 8 in the last 10 months that are still in the development phase. We have dusted off those landscape plans. We've gone out and done inspections on those. So we've done a number of inspections and re-inspections. I understand that was an area that had been lacking previously. So we are trying moving forward. And with developments, we actually do have a little bit more leverage because we are holding on to letters of credit that developers desperately want to get released when they feel their developments are complete, and have been hanging on to those until all landscape is done. So there is some leverage on the development side as we are doing a better job of going out and inspecting and holding them to that. It is a little more difficult on the homeowner side because it's tough to even know what's happening unless someone sees it or someone calls and reports it. So with that being said, I'm just about done with my slides here. So the last section is the residential planned unit development. So with the DNR's model ordinance, there are some very specific standards and calculations for those that are looking to have some increased density in a shoreland district by using a PUD. One of the important provisions in that language is that a PUD is not to be used to circumvent the effectiveness of any natural resources or protections, and that any necessary protections are implemented in a manner that's equal to or greater than would result from standard zoning. So the ordinance is really set up to make sure that a PUD is not a way to try and get around some of these standards. So specifically to a PUD, there is a tier calculation that determines how much density is allowed in a shoreline district within a PUD. This is the same tier calculation that's in our existing ordinance. So we currently have this tiering structure in place, but there were a number of the other items in the DNR's model ordinance related to this that were not necessarily in our ordinance that will be going forward, including that there are mandatory HOA or covenants that govern the future protections and preservation of natural resources in that areas. There's a number of specific design, erosion control, and stormwater management criteria that are required for PUDs. And then there's also a requirement that if you are going to develop via PUD, that you must have at least 50% of that project area as open space. And within that 50%, that must include at least 70% of the shore impact zone, which is 50% of the setback, the ordinary high water line setback, 70% of that shore impact zone preserved in its natural state. So it's the PUD provision is meant to allow additional density, provides very specific calculation, and then provides a number of protections when that density is allowed. And that concludes my highlights.
Thanks, Marty. Good job. Council, anybody want to go first for questions, comments?
This is Deb. I will start. I will just commend both the Lake and Water Quality Commission and the Planning Commission for their good work on this. It's thorough. It's great. Great work. Thank you.
Yep, long time in coming, but well done, well thought out. Council, anybody else?
This is Judy. I just wanted to say that I was on the Water Quality Committee last year, and I learned a lot. And they were working on this last year, and the idea with the committee when they were talking about changing the shoreline rules was they wanted to give people an opportunity to buy waterfront property and not have to spend over, you know, in today's market, an acre on a lake is probably $1 million with a house. So they wanted it to be affordable, and they weren't picking people, just picking, you know, a certain class of people to be allowed to live around the lake. When I saw all the detail that the staff and the quality committee went through to come up with this ordinance, and I read every single page of it, and I'm telling you that I don't see. We're talking about going from an acre to just under an acre, just under half an acre. I'm sorry, and that's still a lot. That's still a pretty good sized lot. And with all the stipulations and the requirements that are put in place, I wholeheartedly agree in this ordinance. The lakes that we're talking about are compromised. They're going to have to be cleaned up and made presentable to make them valuable. And the one good lake that we do have the possibility of getting is Piersons, and they just got zebra mussels. So we're going to have to work on that as well. So I say good job. Thank you.
Thanks. Council, anyone else? Hearing none. Marty, would you put
This is Tom. The due diligence in this policy has been extraordinary, and the amount of work is extraordinary. So you have to give a lot of people credit, including the Lakes and Water Quality Committee and the Planning Commission and a lot of other people. I just have one question. There's a beautiful development on Schutz Lake called Waterford Landing, which is a lot of villas close together, but they're built away from the lake. There's a buffer zone. There's only one access to the lake. There's only one dock. With this new policy, this new procedure, can Waterford Landing be built again? I mean, that's just a general question. Would Waterford Landing be built again, either on Schutz Lake or any other lake?
Council member vote, members of the council, I actually, so in anticipation that we might have that question, I've pulled up a couple of maps here I will share with you if you bear with me for one moment while I pull them up. So this is a very crude, unscientific mock-up of what this development could have been if it would have been developed under straight zoning. So you're looking at potentially 3 to 4 riparian lots with an additional 13 to 14 non-riparian lots based on what the current straight zoning would have been if someone wanted to just use straight zoning. So you're looking at about 17 lots that could have been yielded, give or take, again, with different designs on this property under the current ordinance. If the provisions for the updated ordinance were in place, you would see a little bit more density potential in a straight ordinance. You'd go from 3 to 4 to potentially 4 to 5 riparian lots with some additional non-riparian lots. But you're at about 24 lots total as opposed to 17. Again, varied based on how someone would have designed this if they were looking to try to do that in straight zoning. So you would have an increase if someone were to want to do straight zoning. But even with the updated ordinance, if someone were to choose to do something like the Waterford, it would go through a PUD process just like the Waterford did to be able to allow the density to allow up to, I think, that unit that has 32 or so homes in that area. So yes, with the updated ordinance, you can get more density. Obviously, you've got some smaller lots than what are in the existing city limits. But again, just a very crude kind of drawing of this shows that it's about 7-ish more lots in this configuration that would have fit under straight zoning versus straight zoning in the current ordinance.
Mm-hmm. Thanks.
Marty, under Waterford, that was a PUD, and all of the villa lots, are they smaller than 15,000 square feet?
They are and that's what you are allowed to do within a PUD. So if you are going through the PUD route, there is a calculation that essentially says how many lots an area can yield per tier away from the water. So on a recreational development lake, I want to say the first tier is like 267 feet from the water. So essentially this would be your tier 1. And then I believe it's another 200 feet beyond that. So then you'd have a tier 2 and a tier 3 and a tier 4 and a tier 5. You then can do a calculation based on the baseline shoreland zoning that tells you how many lots you can yield in each of those tiers. Then that's where you have the ability to create smaller lot area and lot width than what the straight zoning would require. So similar to a non-shoreland PUD, right, where a lot of times we're seeing a request to reduce what our standard lot area and lot width are in return for something to benefit the city. And in these shoreland PUDs, that requirement is at least 50% of the project area being open space. So that's another thing when you're getting those smaller lots, you have to have at least half of that as open space. You do need to have at least 70% of your shoreline that is natural riparian buffer. So that is the give back for allowing some smaller lot sizes.
Thank you.
Okay, council, any other questions? Okay, hearing none. Marty, would you put the resolution up on the screen for the council, please?
I will.
Hey, Alyssa, do you have the agenda that you can bring
Is it
up?
not sharing? Sorry, I've got it on my screen. I thought I was sharing it.
No.
There we go.
We're just looking at each other.
Sorry about that.
Council, if there's no further discussion, can I get a motion, please?
I'll make
Section 22, Shoreland District Regulations for the Victoria Zone adoption of the updated Shoreland District Regulations Ordinance and approve a resolution for summary publication of the ordinance.
Thank you. Can I get a second, please?
Second
motion.
I think Councilmember Gregory was first, so he's the second.
Okay.
Roll call vote, please. Deb?
Aye.
Judy?
Aye.
Councilmember Gregory?
Aye.
Councilmember Vogt?
Aye.
And I vote aye. Resolution passes unanimously. Marty, does that close out item 6.1 then? Or is there
That does close out item 6.1, and as I mentioned earlier in the presentation, with that adoption, staff will move forward to complete the steps needed for final approval by the DNR.
Alrighty, thanks, Marty. Is the next one yours also?
Yes, it is.
All right, the floor is yours. Go ahead and proceed.
All right, let me get my next presentation up. All right, are you all seeing that?
Yep.
No.
Excellent. So the next item, as Councilmember McMillan alluded to, with any significant change to a section of ordinance, a lot of times that results in some other areas of the ordinance that need to be updated or revised as well to make sure that things remain consistent. So as you saw in your background packet, we do have a few sections of the zoning code that also would require some amendment based on the Shoreland ordinance adoption. So we just want to buzz through what those updated ordinance sections would be. And then again, similar to the Shoreland ordinance, we'd be asking the council to consider approval of those zoning code amendments, as well as approving a resolution for summary publication. So not nearly as many areas to go through here. We've got a few definitions. We've got some amendments to the accessory structures and deck sections, a few changes to the residential district section, and then an amendment to the preservation of natural resources section. So first, a lot of these definitions you are going to see are identical to what was included in the Shoreland district regulations ordinance. Some of the revisions that were made in the Shoreland ordinance for consistency and governance, we wanted to update in the general zoning code definitions as well. This definition of deck, you'll see in a couple of slides here, this information in blue is not new language. It just was not included in the definition. And within the Shoreland ordinance, we wanted to define it with that language. So we have revised the deck definition to include that language as well. Detached garage, a small administrative update to this as we were looking at accessory structures and water-oriented accessory structures and the number of those structures. The conversation came up about detached garages and what and how, if that could all of a sudden become an attached garage. So this definition update essentially is to say that if you are to attach a detached garage with some sort of breezeway or walkway, if it's not sharing a common vertical wall with your principal structure, it is still a detached garage for purposes of accessory structures and setbacks and the amount that are allowed. Impervious surface, as we discussed in Shoreland, for consistency, looking at taking that definition over as well, that removes the exemption of swimming pools for impervious surface. Patio or detached deck, same with Shoreland, as we've defined it in Shoreland. We want to have that defined within our general zoning code as well and be defined as an accessory structure. Same with permeable patio or walkway. You will notice one slight difference to the general zoning definition in that we took out the second bullet that said that anything over 2% of the lot area would count as impervious. We did not feel that that stringent of a requirement to cap at 2% was as necessary outside of a shoreland district. So if you are doing this outside of a shoreland district, you do have some additional capability to offset your impervious surface with approved permeable materials. Public waters, this is the DNR's definition of public waters, so we thought it made sense to update our general zoning definition to be the same and refer to state statutes. And then, as we mentioned, the definition for steep slopes would revert back to the previous definition, and then the section 3310 that we'll get to in a minute is what relates to this. I will show you those proposed revisions as well. So within section 1810 of accessory structures, a lot of just minor administrative language type things, removing building or structure, just referring to an accessory structure, since that is what we are defining. We did want to, because we are now considering patios or detached decks as accessory structures, we wanted them to be accepted from the prohibition of having an accessory structure within 10 feet of a principal structure, because someone may want to have a patio within 10 feet of their structure, and this would allow that. We did discuss accessory dwelling units. This is likely something that will be on the Planning Commission's plate for discussion at future meetings, because right now the city allows accessory dwelling units within residential districts, but does not have a lot of regulation around it and not a lot of information as to what is and isn't allowed. In the Shoreland district, there is some specific DNR required language related to those accessory dwelling units. But one of the conversations with the Planning Commission is that we didn't necessarily want to have all of these accessory structures popping up in areas both within the shoreline and outside of the shoreline. So our current ordinance says that an individual can have 2 of the 3, either a detached garage, attached garage, or shed. You are allowed to have 2 of the 3. We have added a detached accessory dwelling unit to that as well, and saying you can have 2 of the 4, so that we are counting those that are conditional uses within our residential district, so that they don't end up being an additional accessory structure on a property. E is not a new provision. It was just it was combined with a previous position, so we pulled it out in its own bullet, just to be clear that accessory structures are not to be located on public easements or other easements dedicated to the city without the city approving those to be there. The accessory structure section here about building code. So again, this is partially updated just for modern times. We are no longer requiring those written drawings. We are accepting electronic plans of these copies. And again, changing buildings to structures for consistency with the definition. And then this again is not a new provision. You can see the provision that is struck out below, that any accessory structure less than 200 square feet requires a zoning permit. That is required so that we can ensure it meets setbacks. We can ensure that it is not in easements, that sort of thing. And because we are having patios or detached decks as accessory structures, we also, that wouldn't necessarily trigger a building permit. We've included them in the list for a zoning permit as well. The next section is decks. As I mentioned, that language that is now in the definition is already included in this section. This again is a cleanup language that if that deck is directly abutting or attached, it is considered a deck and part of the principal structure. And then we also wanted to, in this section, add a note about patios and detached decks, and that they are considered accessory structures and subject to those setbacks. We've got a few things in our residential district. So because patios and detached decks are now considered accessory structures, we wanted to include some bulk regulations as to where those should be located. These are the same types of regulations, same front, rear, and side yard setbacks as a shed or a pool or any of those other accessory type uses. So we will are proposing adding that to the bulk regulations table. In addition, and this is one of those reasons why we take a look at all of these different ordinance sections when we are making ordinance changes, we did find an inconsistency within our code in our Lake Minnetonka residential district. Actually had standards in that section of code that are less than what had been required in the Shoreland district regulations for lot area and lot width for those general development lakes. So this is a cleanup of that to make that consistent with the Shoreland district regulations. And then finally, section 3310, the preservation of natural resources. This was the section that spoke to steep slopes and the clearing of trees and things in those areas. So with the change of the percentage, this has been revised to keep the same information that with a high density of significant trees shall be preserved in their natural state to the greatest extent practicable. Clear cutting of steep slopes is prohibited, but clearing and trimming of trees is allowed pursuant to provisions of the Tree Preservation and Replacement Ordinance. This is the same language as in the Shoreland Ordinance. And then this information is also bulleted as conditions in the Shoreland Ordinance that provided that perennial ground cover is retained and a maintenance monitoring plan is established, and that a grading, filling, or erosion permit is required for the movement of more than 10 cubic yards of material on a steep slope. And those are the additional zoning updates that are being proposed.
All right, thank you, Marty. The council, anybody want to go first? Questions, comments?
This is Judy. This is very thorough. I appreciate all the hard work that you put into this, and thank you.
Thank you. Deb, Tom G, Tom B, any other comments, questions?
This is very good. Thank you.
Nothing for me, Mayor.
Thank you, Deb. Tom G?
Marty.
All right, we're good. Thank you, Marty. Council? May I have a motion, please?
Make a motion to adopt the ordinance amending sections of the Victoria zoning code as presented by staff and approve a resolution for summary publication of the ordinance.
Thank you. Can I get a second, please?
Second. Oops, sorry.
I heard Judy first. Judy got the second. Roll call vote. Deb?
Aye.
Thank you. Judy?
Aye.
Thank you. Tom G?
Aye.
Tom B?
Aye.
I vote aye. Motion carries unanimously. Marty, was that all you needed for this item?
That is, and that concludes my items for the evening. Thank you, Mayor, members of the council.
All right, Marty, thanks. Good work.
Thank you.
Next up, the roundtable. The council, is there anybody that wants to add anything to the roundtable? Reminder, this is just for us to come up with topics that we want the staff to research. Council, anything? Okay, hearing none. Reports, Bob?
Mayor and council, all is quiet in the legal department. You caught me off guard, Mayor, but nothing to report. Thank you.
All right, thanks. Dana?
Thank you, Mayor. I'd just like to add that City Hall will be closed on Wednesday in honor of Veterans Day. So thank you to all who have served.
Ooh, yes, thank you. The I'm sorry, Deb, any reports?
Oh, microphone, Deb.
Let me try that.
You're muted.
Let me try that again.
Thanks.
I just want to say thank you to the city staff led by Cindy Patnode and all the election judges, the voters in Victoria for a successful, smooth running election. And congratulations go to the two new council members elect, Derek Gunderson and Chad Roberts. Thanks so much for to the city staff for their hard work. That's a big undertaking and a big project. So thank you for your good work on that.
Yes, Cindy has never failed to deliver on that regard, so, or in anything else for that matter. But Judy, any reports?
No, I just want to reiterate what Deb said. It was we've got a great staff, and I just really want them to know how much I appreciate everything that they do for us.
All right, thank you. Tom G?
No report.
I'm sorry, I couldn't hear you.
Oh, no report, sorry.
Oh, thank you. Tom B?
No report.
All right, I have nothing else. At this point, council, could I get a motion for adjournment, please?
I make a motion, we adjourn.
Motion from Deb, thank you. Second, please.
Second.
Second from Judy. Roll call vote. Deb?
Aye.
Judy?
Aye.
Tom Gregory?
Aye.
Tom vote?
Aye.
I vote aye also. Thank you, everybody. Thanks, staff. We are adjourned. We'll see you guys Friday at the special meeting for the canvassing. Good night, everybody.
Night.